I welcome Professor Olivier Piguet and Associate Professor Hamish McDougall to the stage to tell us about virtual reality exploring new dimensions.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you for the kind introduction. Welcome everyone to tonight's Sydney Science Forum. I need to speak like that. I'll hold that. All right, so I'll start again. So welcome and to tonight's Sydney Science Forum. And also congratulations for braving this weather. That's no mean feat. It's not often that it rains in Sydney, so it's good, I guess, we have a little bit of rain. So I'm Olivier Piguet, and tonight I'm here to talk to you about dementia, because this is one of the great medical challenges of the 21st century.
And I'm Hamish, and we've got a bit of a team effort on our side tonight. I've also got Elodie here standing centre stage, and Jonathan's over there on the console because we hope to show you something a little bit different tonight. This is PowerPoint that you're looking at, and PowerPoint has been the standard tool for presentation now for 28 years. Tonight we won't be using PowerPoint. This doesn't count as a new dimension as far as we're concerned. What we're planning to do is to try and show you what we've been doing with Olivier and in virtual reality in general, using virtual reality. So this could be a little bit chaotic. This is all going to happen live in real time, and it takes 3 of us to drive, so please be gentle if it looks like a mess. First, I want to start by explaining what it is you're seeing on the screen, since we're all used to too much PowerPoint. That line in the centre, that's Elodie's avatar. You can see that the body movements she makes in real life are mapped onto the avatar's movements. And she sees the virtual world that we've prepared for you through the eyes of the lion, if you like. I wanted to also talk a bit about the screen that we're being forced to watch this on. Ideally, we'd all wear a pair of virtual reality goggles for this presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have the budget for hundreds of pairs of VR goggles yet. But tonight we're going to watch it through this screen. Now, this is an enormous screen, gigantic it seems to me, but it's actually a tiny, tiny slice of the visual world that Elodie's seeing in the goggles. I made this model on the left-hand side to try and explain that the person sitting at the average distance in this theatre sees a slice of the world we're presenting that's just 20 degrees wide, this green wedge in the foreground. Whereas Elodie's goggles present a field of view of over 100 degrees wide. That's more like the blue wedge. And as soon as she moves her head around, of course, she can look 360 degrees around. If we were to try and do that at this scale, in a room this size with screens like that, we'd need more than 100 of them arrayed in a giant sphere. So I guess I'm trying to explain that we're just looking through a tiny little window on what she's experiencing. In addition to that, the resolution she's getting is 2.5 times higher than what we're getting on this screen. And we're watching 30 frames a second. She's getting 120 frames a second. And the reason why that needs to happen is that she's going to move her head around fairly rapidly, and the system needs to provide images very quickly and with a very low latency. Otherwise, people get motion sick. So the vision and the head movements need to match. Unfortunately for us, the vision and the motion are not going to match. We're mostly going to have our head still, and we're going to move the camera quite a lot. And the second video on the right is my explanation for why we're going to move the camera a lot. Someone's going to think, can't they just keep that camera still? The idea is that if we continuously move the camera, then we can help your brain make sense of a 3-dimensional world on a 2-dimensional flat screen. So this simple video is showing that that world looks 3-dimensional even on a laptop screen because the person continuously moves the camera. Now, if you're one of those people that's sensitive to motion, I suggest that you close your eyes like you might at the IMAX theatre, and any sort of unpleasant effects will soon dissipate. So now we're going to make a start with the motion I've just described, and Elodie's going to take us over to the first section. What we've set up here is a circular theatre in the round in reverse, if you like. We've put objects all around the outside of this circle that we're going to work our way around. And the first section here is about the introduction or background for virtual reality. Now, I think everybody knows that virtual reality has actually been happening for 50 years in various labs around the world. People have understood that there was something very powerful about the potential of being able to control all of the senses coming into a particular individual's brain. If you can control everything that an individual is connected to via the world, if you like, you can basically do almost anything. Unfortunately, the technology wasn't up to it for a long, long time. My first exposure to virtual reality was on a project 20 years ago. It flew on the space shuttle. And one of the teams, not our team, but another team, flew what was, at the time, the world's best virtual reality headset. I think they said it cost something like $60,000 for this headset. I was so excited to try this on. I'd seen all the Hollywood movies that you've seen about virtual reality. I was so excited to get these goggles on. It was awful. Tiny little field of view, super low resolution. As soon as I moved my head, the thing lagged and everybody felt completely sick. I thought, oh, that's horrible, basically. Fast forward 20 years to now, and the big question people are asking me quite a lot is, why is this happening now? 50 years of history, why are we all getting excited about virtual reality this year and in the last couple of years? And the reason is the technology has moved along. So trillions of dollars have been invested in developing cell phones, the supercomputers you now have in your pockets. And as a result of that, we have fast, affordable, high-resolution, small displays. We also have movement sensors, inertial measurement movement sensors inside your phone so that you can play games. These are the sensors that virtual reality relies on to make sure that the visual world moves with your real head movements. And we have graphics cards. The gamers have pushed the technology on graphics cards so hard, wanting more smoke and more fire, that the graphics cards in our PCs now are like supercomputers, pumping trillions of pixels into LED's goggles a second. So a couple of years ago, these components came together and there was a thing called the Oculus Rift. I think most of you know that a chap listed this as a Kickstarter and received $2 million in backing overnight, and since sold the technology off to Facebook for $2 billion. So suddenly we hear, whoa, something's happening. We're not using the Oculus Rift, we're using a different headset called an HTC Vive. That's a model of the Vive, similar to the one on LED's face. And the reason we use this one is because it has an amazing position tracking system. There are the two little boxes you can see glowing in the air on the top of these tripods. They're scanning out infrared laser beams which help the goggles solve for position. And it means that LED can move anywhere within a 4x4 metre volume. Naturally, you can walk over to one side of the room, pick up an object with your 6 degrees of freedom controllers, carry it to another part of the room. It's sort of, you're in the virtual world, not just looking at it if you were sitting with a basic Oculus Rift. Now, this tracking system was made, I thought this was great, it was made by a guy named Alan Yates. He was originally from Sydney. He now works in Seattle for the Valve Corporation because he's far too clever for words. The tracking system that he's implemented here replaces $500,000 worth of motion capture equipment in our laboratory, and you can have it it's basically bundled with this headset, so it's a couple of $100 worth of hardware. Genius, I think. Australians should be proud of this in the same way they're proud of cochlear implants, in my opinion, because it's just, the tracking system is off the scale. And the second question that I get asked over and over is, okay, that's why is this happening now, but why is it happening here? Why is this virtual reality so exciting at the University of Sydney and at the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney? Now, the reason for that is that we have a head of school, Franz Stratton, here with a bit of vision, and he's allowed us to set up what we think is a world-class facility just in time for virtual reality to really explode. So this is a model of our laboratory, and you can see we have a full car simulator there for urban driving. In the back corner, we have a 6 degrees of freedom motion simulator. It looks like a giant tank on legs. We've got 4 more simulators here for the codes lab that can be connected together, and that's all about researching decision making. And then back in the other half of the building, we've got what I think is our biggest asset, a giant open space. This is the giant open space. You can see originally it had 30 students sitting in cubicles according to the floor plan. We cleared all of that out and we made a giant room 10 by 10 metres. And the reason why it's our biggest asset is because into that space we can map anything you can imagine. It can be a hospital ward, or it can be a battlefield, or it can be the contents of someone's blood. And so that space we think is the most utilised space at the university, and it's part of the reason why it's happening here at the School of Psychology.
So as you can see, there's an amazing technology here. And with Hamish, we've been working for the past year or so to try to see how we can use this amazing and versatile tool to dementia, and how we can apply that to find new solutions to this major health problem. And what we want to do tonight is to take you through this journey and show you a few examples of what can be done with virtual reality. But I guess some of you might think, well, is dementia really such a big problem? I think it is. I've been working on it for about 20 years. But just to illustrate how big this problem is, I'll start by asking you a question. In the audience, how many of you know someone with dementia? Either a family member, a friend, or know someone who is in this situation? If you could raise your hand, please. Yeah, that's what I thought. It's a lot of people. Me, I have a cousin who was 54 when he was diagnosed with early onset dementia, frontotemporal dementia. Until then, he was a successful optometrist. He had 2 teenage daughters, was married, was happy life. And there's this diagnosis. 3 years later, he needs full-time care. He's still living at home under very stressful condition for his wife and his daughters. And he's about to be moved to a nursing home. So we have something, a disease that is affecting everyone across the community. It's not just a disease of old people, it affects also young people. Now, I also wanted to ask you another question. What do you think are the major causes of death in Australia? Any taker? Pardon? Heart disease? I heard cancer. Yeah. Lung disease. Okay, 5 years ago, dementia was about 8 or 9 on this chart. Now it's number 2. So it's just behind heart disease. And within 2 years, it's expected to be number 1. So again, we have a problem here. Now, also, if we look at the number of cases of dementia in Australia, we're talking 400,000 people with a diagnosis of dementia today. 400,000 people, and about 250 people diagnosed every day. New cases of dementia every day, 250 cases. Now, by 2050, this number will treble. Now we'll have 1.2 million people with dementia and 650 new cases every day. Now, do we have the resources to look after these people? Do we have the capacity? Resources, financial resources, staff training, facilities? No, we don't. So we need to find new solutions. We need to find ways to look after these people. Now, why is that? Because there's this aging of the population. So we've been successful at treating various disorders and diseases. We live longer. But now we also have this problem, is that more people in this age bracket means also more people with dementia, potentially. Now, the last one I want to tell you about is the cost. Now, in developed countries, it's estimated that dementia costs about 1% of GDP. In Australia, it means $14.2 billion. It's billion with a B, not million with an M, per year. In direct and indirect costs. So I was trying to break that down. It amounts to $452 per second. Now, That's a lot of money. And again, we can't afford that. We need to find new solutions, and I think that's where working with new technologies such as virtual reality will help us achieve these goals.
Now, perhaps I'm not the only one, but I don't understand numbers as big as that. I just cannot visualise $1.6 million, and I can't visualise 1.2 million people. Luckily, virtual reality is an extremely good way to visualise data. So we started to try and help to understand, well, how much money are we really talking there? What do those numbers mean? So Elodie's here, and she's just going to show you what a stack of $100 notes worth $27,000 looks like. So that's $27,000. You could buy a nice car for that, and that's what's will be wasted or invested, if you like, in dementia per minute. If you have a look at this stack of money behind there, this is a stack of $100 notes, 2.5 metres tall, taller than you can reach. It's $1.6 million worth of $100 notes. You could buy a pretty flash house for that. Behind there, that's an hourly spend on dementia. The stack behind that is a one-day spend. So this is a stack of $100 notes. You need a pallet to put it on. You can't reach the top of it. You're going to spend that every day. But the number that I think I couldn't even barely understand was $14.25 billion. Now, this was so many dollars that even the graphics card on the computer struggled to render this much money. It's the amount of money that would cover a squash court, and if you were to try and take it home, you'd need 3 shipping containers full of $100 notes. That's what Australia is going to have to spend per year in 2050 to deal with this problem if we don't improve the situation. So saving 1% of that would be a very nice outcome for everyone. We could spend that money on something like public housing, for example, and buy a whole street of houses. And I think that helped me a little. So what about the cases? I tried to get my head around what on earth does 1.2 million cases look like? So in the room we're sitting in now, there's 600 seats. That's the number of new patients per day we'll expect in 2050. Here comes Elodie to sit in one of the cheap seats. And she would then be 600 of her per day new cases of dementia. So I tried to imagine, well, what's that per year? And if Jono zooms out for us, if you were to put theatres this size, side by side and end on end, to represent 1 year of new cases of dementia in 2050, it would cover the entire university campus with the same density we have now. Shoulder to shoulder, knees against the back of seats, as far as you can see all the way across the university. So that's the size of the numbers we're talking about.
So, another question that I get very often is, well, are there drugs for dementia? I mean, we hear about it in the newspaper, on television, on the radio. Well, yes and no. There are drugs, but the existing drugs don't treat the disease. What they do is harness the potential of what's left in the brains of people affected by dementia, but they don't slow down the disorder or stop the disease or cure it. And also, do you know when the last drugs against dementia were put on the market? It was 2003. So 15 years ago. Since then, no new drugs on the market. Literally hundreds of drug trials, and a success rate that is less than 1%. So we're talking failures across the board, and huge amounts of money is being spent. And to develop a new drug takes a long time, obviously, and is very costly. Now, then the question is, well, why is that? Well, because dementia is not one disorder, it's not one disease, but we're talking about different disorders. And here there's an example of the major types of dementia. We're talking Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, and dementia with Lewy bodies, but the list goes on and on and on. And each of these diseases actually have different pathologies in the brain. So they're characterized by brain atrophy and loss of nerve cells, but the basic mechanisms underlying these different pathologies, different types of dementia, are different. So, which obviously creates a problem when we want to, I clicked a bit too quickly, doesn't matter, but when we want to find or design new drugs. Well, drugs doesn't work. So what do we do then to, well, I'll backtrack one step, is that these different disorders means that there's a difficulty in diagnosing people with the right disease, which also delayed what we can do in terms of interventions and support for these individuals and their families. So what we're left with at the moment is to try to use other tools. Clinical examinations and also tools like an MRI scan, so which is used very commonly now in major hospitals around Australia and around the world. And this is just an example of some individuals with dementia. And you can see they are vertical slices going back to front and being moving, so they're moving back to front like that. And all these individuals have a different types of dementia. It doesn't matter which type. But just to illustrate the fact that what you can see is that you can see some areas that are black and some areas that are gray. So the black is denoting where there's brain shrinkage, there's brain atrophy. So you can see that there are a couple of cases, the top one in particular, that where the atrophy is quite pronounced. But for clinician, what is important is to see how much atrophy there is and where the atrophy is, because that will help us understand which type of dementia it is and therefore direct the person towards the right support and interventions. Now, the problem is that patients or people with dementia often, very commonly, have also difficulties with their thinking abilities and therefore don't necessarily understand new situations, unusual situations, noisy situations, which is an MRI scan. And so there's a proportion of patients with dementia who can't have an MRI scan because of these reasons. They're too scared to go in there because it's noisy, it's unsettling, it's claustrophobic. And this is an example where virtual reality can certainly help.
Yes, it so happens that we already use virtual reality to try and solve this problem of the fear of undergoing a medical procedure such as an MRI. We tend to use it more in children. So children are very unhappy about being put into an MRI scanner. They often have to be sedated or they come away with really bad memories and experiences. So we collaborate with some colleagues at Westmead who are trying to pre-expose children to this procedure in a virtual, controlled and safe manner until on the day they're great, they're completely happy to jump up on the bed and lie down and keep still while the machine makes this horrible noise. You can see Elodie's lying inside the machine now, and she started the sound of an MRI machine. It's not music, basically. It sounds pretty awful, like the machine's trying to kill you or something. And you have to lie in there without moving for minutes, tens of minutes perhaps. We think that virtual reality works really well on kids to get them happy with that, and that it's almost certainly going to have good applications in patients with dementia. The second thing in this medical scan part of the virtual world that we prepared for you is about visualising scan data. Now, Olivia explained the slices that we saw before, the typical way of looking at MRI data. Again, that's something that, it takes years of practice to understand what you're looking at and where you should be looking. Instead, with virtual reality, you can reconstruct a volume of data into a three-dimensional object. And this object is so much easier to understand than slice that you're reconstructing in your mind, because it's reconstructed in the air as what appears to be a solid three-dimensional piece of information, if you like. Now, this is a real scan of a real patient of a colleague of ours. She has a serious problem. That everything you can see in blue there is a tumour that she has in her sinuses, and that tumour has to come out. Now, recently in the lab, we had two surgeons wearing the goggles and manipulating this data set, arguing about whether it was best to approach this tumour up through the nose or whether they were going to approach through the skull. And the big problem they were discussing was that the tumour and the carotid artery are what they called co-located there. Basically, the tumour has grown into the carotid artery. If they take that tumour, they will almost certainly kill this woman. So with this level of detail and spatial awareness, they were able to do some virtual surgical planning, and we're yet to find out the fate of this woman. But without this additional help, I think she was almost certainly in big, big trouble.
So we have a couple of tests or technologies that we can use in the clinic. I talked about MRI scans because other tests like blood tests, saliva tests, CSF tests, they're being under development, but they're not very accurate. For the reasons I explained earlier, is that we're not talking about one disease, but multiple disorders. So as clinicians, what we end up doing is spending a lot of time with the patients and their families to try to understand exactly what is happening to them. And to do that, we, as neuropsychologists, I spent a fair amount of time taking individuals who come to the clinic through a series of tests of thinking abilities. And basically, or broadly, what we do is look at what we call the 5 main cognitive domains. So we look at attention concentration, we look at language, we look at visuospatial, constructional abilities, so your capacity to understand visual information, and also your ability to solve problems using novel solutions. But particularly, and so that's an example of some of the tests we would ask a person to do, either to draw this cube or to copy this figure and then try to remember it later on. But certainly what we do, we spend a lot of time on memory. Why memory? Well, because memory is central to who we are. If we don't have memory, it becomes a bit difficult to navigate the world. But also because that's often the most common complaint that people have when they come to the clinic. And even people who don't come to the clinic, when you talk to people around you, when you get to your even 40s, 50s, people start saying, well, you know, I can't remember where I left my keys. I went to the supermarket the other day, parked the car, and then couldn't find it. Took me half an hour. Now, apparently I went to see some friends on the weekend. I have no recollections of what we did. Now, it happens to all of us. Now, the question is, well, is it part of the normal aging process, or is it something that we need to worry about? So that's why we do these tests. Now, the other aspect why memory is important is that a memory deficit in the capacity to learn novel information is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So that's the central diagnostic criterion for Alzheimer's disease. So we really need to make sure that we can identify that clearly and objectively. Now, we've done some research in past few years looking at memory in Alzheimer's disease, but also in other forms of dementia, and particularly in frontotemporal dementia, which is the one that I'm mostly interested in. And it's just to show you that even in these disorders, other non-Alzheimer's dementias, what you find is that some people have memory problems. So here is just to illustrate that. On the left-hand side, you have 2 bars that are very low compared to a higher one. And what it's saying is that you have 2 groups of dementia patients, one with Alzheimer's disease, one with frontotemporal dementia, and they're doing just as bad on these memory tests compared to controls. Now, we have a problem there because we meant to know or to believe that memory problems is indicative of Alzheimer's disease, whereas if your memory is preserved, you have another form of dementia, and this is showing that it's not the case. Now then the question is, well, why is that? Well, actually, we're still using tests, memory tests that were developed about 60 years ago. So the test I showed you, the figure there, this design, was designed by a neuropsychologist who was from Geneva, actually. And he designed that in 1950s, and it's 2018, and we still use it. I mean, it's a good test, but we can do better. We can do better than that. Now, more recently, what we started doing is looking at other forms of memory. Oh, and the other aspect of memory testing is that you do that in the clinic. You do that in an environment that is very artificial. And the way you do these tests also is very artificial. You go and sit down with a person who say, well, look, I'm going to read your list of words, and now I want you to pay attention to these words. I want you to remember all the words you can remember from this list. So you read the list, then you ask the person, well, can you tell me all the words you can remember? This happens. Then you do that a second time, and then a third time, and then a fourth time, and so on. And then after that, you say, well, now I'm going to ask you about these words in a moment. I want you to try to remember these words. Now, it's not how memory works, is it? We don't walk around thinking, oh, yes, I need to remember this, that, and the other. Memory is something that happens as we live. And when we need to retrieve information, then we call upon this information that is stored somewhere in our brain. Now, these tests obviously are not mapping on these features. So more recently, we're thinking, well, are there different ways to do that? And one aspect that we started looking at was topographical orientation, so how you can find your way navigating in space. And there, again, if you look at these bars, all you need to know is that if you look at the right-hand side, you have the patients with Alzheimer's disease compared to all the other groups. Now, suddenly, we have a test where it looks like we can differentiate between the different types of dementia. But again, talking to Hamish, then suddenly there's a whole world of possibilities where we can explore that in greater details.
Yes, so in the virtual reality laboratory at the School of Psychology, we do similar types of tests. We also want to know about spatial ability, navigation skills, hippocampal function, but we're normally doing these experiments in normal subjects. Elodie's going to show you here an example of what one of our tests looks like. So we don't draw a paper and pencil version of a maze and ask people to find their way through the maze. We put people in the streets of Paris in this example. You know, from this perspective, a bird's eye perspective, it's all very easy to say, oh, there's the hotel, 3 blocks down and 1 block to the left, because you can see it. But in real life, you're down in the streets. You need completely different strategies to find your way back to the hotel. You need to remember the sequence of turns, or you need to remember the landmarks that you saw, the bakery, or is that the bakery? I remember I turned left at the church, and oh dear, there's another church. This is the kind of task that we would expose first-year students to, and so we think that this might have some benefit in dementia as well.
Absolutely, and that's an excellent example because, again, we have a naturalistic environment, a naturalistic situation. It's not in the lab anymore. You are in the real world and you are doing something that you would do in everyday life. And what I like particularly about this test is that disorientation in space is one of the first signs of dementia. So when you start losing your bearings in unknown environment, it's telling you something about what is happening to your brain. Now, also, as I mentioned briefly before, is that for us now, we have a test of topographical orientation that would enable us to differentiate between different types of dementia, like Alzheimer's disease versus frontotemporal dementia. So that, for me, is very exciting. I think there are other possibilities, aren't there, Hamish?
Yeah, we have another example of a test that we use in the lab that's designed to elicit an autonomic response. So, as well as being scientifically interesting, it never gets old putting people in the lab through this kind of demonstration. We ask them to step out onto a plank on the 57th floor of a building, and every participant knows that they're just wearing a pair of VR goggles. They know that they're standing on the carpet. But most refuse to step out of the elevator and walk on this carpet plank. And, you know, they laugh and they giggle and they say, oh, I know this is not real, but they feel all of the autonomic responses that they would get if it was real fear. So their pulse races, their respiration goes way up, they start to get sweaty hands and sweaty underarms, and yet the reason this stimulus is so powerful is that we are talking directly to the ancient parts of their brain stem, the parts of their brain that evolved to respond to fight-flight scenarios like this, and without which an appropriate response would lead to the end of you as an individual, or perhaps your entire species. These are powerful ingrained responses, and we use them because they're useful for things like flooding phobias. If you're afraid of heights, for example, you can use a virtual version of gradual exposure to reveal yourself of those symptoms. But what do you think in dementia?
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Well, no, I wouldn't bring people with dementia on a test like this one and ask them to walk a plank like this, but it's telling me something extremely important. We know that people with dementia have difficulty with social communications. They have difficulty dealing with emotional situations, with understanding emotional context, information, and generating relevant emotional and responses in social situations. And I think part of it is because of this deficits or this difficulty in engaging this lizard brain, this autonomic system. Because this autonomic system is telling you very important information about, well, if you are in a situation where there's an angry person, it's telling you how to respond to that. So imagine the person with dementia, or rather the carer of the person with dementia. Now, they've been looking after their loved one for a while, and this person with dementia is doing some really odd behaviors, which happens when you have dementia. And at some point, the carer is becoming angry and try to convey that, saying, you can't do these things, you know, and showing all these signs. Now, the person with dementia is not really responding accordingly because there's no signals that are saying, oh, my dear, there's an angry situation here. I need to modify or to understand something. But this person can't anymore. So here we have a system that enabled us to test that. And we could design, or we can design some experiments to see under which conditions this autonomic system is failing to engage. That will help us design interventions with the patients, for example, to help them understand or pay more attention to these internal signals, so the sweaty palms, the beating heart, and so on, but also to explain to carers what is happening to their loved ones. That it's not that they're being difficult, but because there is something in their brain, and we can explain that to them, what is happening and how to respond then accordingly. So I think that's an important aspect of how we can apply virtual reality to dementia. Now, dementia is not something that happens overnight. As we all know, that's a disorder that takes a long time to evolve. And if you are going to have dementia when at 70, it means that by the time you're about 50, 55, something is already happening in your brain. Then when you get to the clinic, the disease doesn't stop here. It continues relentlessly. So you have a progressive disorder that is affecting the brain progressively. And also in terms of predicting the disease course is highly variable. And this is something that we're struggling with as clinicians, is that we don't know how people will be next year or in 2 years' time. And that's a fundamental question that people ask when they come to see us in the clinic. They want to know, well, what is the diagnosis? What do I have, doc? Is that Alzheimer's disease? Is that something else? I think there we're making progress. But then the next question is, well, what next? And then we go, oh, and we're dancing around. We're saying, oh, we're not sure, and we still don't know. But regardless, we still need to find ways to help people with dementia, regardless of the disease stage they're in. And I think that's where virtual reality is immensely resourceful and in helping with these different stages of disease.
Indeed, we prepared just a few examples of this kind of stuff. So you can't just magically cure this problem with drugs or surgery or something. So you have to deal with the consequences. And we think virtual reality is particularly good for this kind of stuff. Basically, similar to the MRI machine we saw before, there are a whole lot of situations that the rest of us just get on and bear. And we go to the dentist, for example, because we know that it's good for our health. And if a patient with dementia doesn't understand that connection between an unpleasant experience and a necessary health benefit, this can be a really problematic situation. They don't understand why they've been put on this table. They don't remember why they've been drilled. So this kind of stuff can be, again, it's gently introduced to the patient. They can get used to the idea of lying down on the dentist's table. It doesn't have to be medical. We set up some other examples here. Elodie's going backwards and forwards through the airport security. Another situation that's particularly nasty, if you think about it, you have to do exactly what you're told at exactly the right time. You have to keep calm. If you've got problems with dementia and you don't follow this situation or understand why you have to behave this way, all sorts of things can go wrong. For example, you'll be taken off and have extra searching, or perhaps you can't go to the airport at all. Perhaps you can't deal with that. You can't go and visit your relatives because you can't get through the airport security. That's a great thing to get people used to. And on another example, well, this seems so trivial, going to the supermarket. All of us go to the supermarket. We deal with that fairly well. We don't like having to jostle with other people. But this is a really horrible situation, I imagine, for people with dementia, because for us, maybe we can't remember where a certain item is. Imagine how much worse that is when you can't remember what it is that you're even looking for. Or perhaps you can't remember why you're even here. This starts to look like a bit like an ominous maze all of a sudden. Shelves and shelves of complicated visual stimuli. You don't know what you're doing here, you don't know where you're going. Gently exposing or training people to deal with the situation as a supermarket, we think would be of huge benefit to patients with dementia. And another example set up in here. Now we want to talk a little bit about helping those that help people with dementia. So to some extent, there are some patients that just cannot be helped with current technology or current therapies. So what can we do to make the best of a bad situation? One thing we can do is use virtual reality to help train or support the people who are having to deal with a patient with dementia. Now, Elodie does something similar to this all of the time. She deals not with patients with dementia, but with patients with vestibular problems. So these people that feel vertigo, they have attacks of vertigo, they see the world moving uncontrollably, and it's very difficult to explain these symptoms to a spouse or to a clinician. There's nothing physically wrong with them, but they describe this sensation, oh, whenever I stand, the world appears to move around, and I'm unstable on my feet, and it makes me feel nauseous and horrible. Her strategy is to show, using virtual reality, show this stimulus to the husband that doesn't understand, or the clinician that's been treating patients for 10 years and never really understood what was being described. She can expose them to that, and we think that would work in dementia as well. That you could produce virtual versions, simulations of the symptoms that dementia brings on, forgetting things, finding your shoes in the fridge instead of in the cupboard, things going mysteriously missing. All of that's possible in virtual reality because we have complete control of the environment. The last example that Elodie's showing here is the training example. So in old age homes, I hear this story about patients with dementia who've lost the ability to inhibit inappropriate sexual behaviour and even violence. And this becomes very difficult for staff. And apparently a good strategy in these situations is to keep a piece of furniture between you and the offending senior. And that sort of stuff is best trained in virtual reality. You don't need a dozen actors to play each of the roles. You don't need an actual physical set. You don't need to do it in the nursing home. You can actually expose the staff, train them to deal with these situations in a safe and comfortable environment like a pair of goggles in the training room in the facility.
Another important aspect in the world of dementia is quality of life. Quality of life of the person with dementia, but also quality of life of the carer, the family members, the friends, and the social network. And that's an area that we're exploring at the moment and see how we can maximize quality of life. And one way of doing that is to ensure a good relationship between the person with dementia and their friends, their family members, their loved ones. Because we know that personal well-being, psychological well-being is dependent on these interactions. The better the interactions, the better you will feel about it. And so then the better the relationship between the patient and the environment, which in turn will improve quality of life. So again, virtual reality here is extremely useful, and Hamish will demonstrate a few examples of that.
So yes, in this last section that relates to therapy, we wanted to talk about some of the more pleasant stuff. Now we've had a whole section of stuff that's all about dealing with and being exposed to unpleasant things. But another huge advantage of virtual reality is that we can use it to improve the quality of life of patients. If I just join in here. So one thing that people often say to me is, oh, but virtual reality, what a lonely experience it must be in the goggles there. It's so isolating from the real world. These people have obviously never been, or not recently been, in virtual reality, because what we find is that there's people everywhere. Today we've set this environment up with all of the doors locked, because otherwise, as soon as we connected to this virtual world, we'd have half a dozen Americans turn up who want to know, oh, what's happening here? What's going on? And if anything, the place gets overcrowded over quickly. So I'm just about to fly over and find Elodie, who is over there. Hello, she's waving her laser beam at me. Thank you very much. I'm a bit disoriented. And so I'm joining in with her now, and the three of us are standing around this game of chess, three-way chess, which speaks to a couple of different things. For a start, one way to keep a high quality of life for patients with dementia is to exercise their minds. So this is a classic example of gamification. In the process of having a great old time playing a game like this, you're actually keeping your cognitive functions alive. The second thing that it's a great example of is social interaction. So the three of us here can see each other. We can each play a round of chess. I think I will move there, and oh dear, looks like I'm in trouble already. This kind of social interaction with virtual reality can be done over enormous distances. So, for example, I could be the spouse or the grandchildren or the husband or the clinician or relatives that now live far away in America. I could put on my goggles and log in with my relative who's stuck in a nursing home, and we could spend time together playing or exercising our minds, if you like, or chatting about old times. Grandchildren might love to visit their grandparent, for example, because the grandparent has fun things to do. She has unicorns and she has castles to visit. So we think this is an amazingly powerful application of virtual reality. It also allows patients with dementia to have access to all sorts of other stuff that they just can't get stuck in a nursing home. They can, example, play their favourite game of golf. They can play their favourite game of golf with their buddies that they used to play real golf with because of the social aspects. They can go fishing. Over here we set up a dock with a fishing rod poking out, and then if that's not adventurous enough, you can go in this boat off into the wild blue yonder to fish with your friends. So this sort of stuff gets us really excited. This is how you can make someone who's trapped in a nursing home's life that much better. But the example that really gets me excited is this garden. Now, you know, nothing looks all that amazing about the environment I'm showing you now. The magic thing about it, though, is that it's been created using a process called photogrammetry. So instead of thousands of hours of modelling, like most of the assets we've shown you today, someone has simply walked around this garden with a digital camera, even maybe a cell phone, taken a bunch of photos, stuck them into the computer, and the computer has rebuilt a 3D version of that particular garden. So we're talking here about tailored help. If you have a patient who has been living in this house for 30 years and she has to go to a nursing home, the idea would be that you could quickly digitise this location and that patient could then return here. They could return to a familiar environment that keeps them calm, they could meditate and they could use mindfulness and relaxation techniques in their own garden years after they were forced to leave. And it doesn't have to stop at their garden. This could be far, far away. This could be the village in which they grew up. So how would that be to be able to take a patient stuck in a nursing home and return them to the happy days they had as a child in an English village 8,000 miles away? It's this kind of stuff that gets us really excited about virtual reality. If you go on YouTube and you Google this kind of stuff, you see, you might assume, oh, surely patients aren't going to want to wear those goggles, it would be all terrifying. You see these amazing videos of very agitated people, very unhappy about being manhandled. The goggles go on the front and you see them just drift away. They're looking at a scene of the sea with the dolphins jumping, and immediately they relax in their chairs and they say, oh, isn't that lovely? Isn't that lovely? We'd love to be able to deliver that kind of application to as many people as possible. And with equipment worth $500, this is quite conceivable in nursing homes.
So we're pretty much at the end of our journey, and what you've seen are just a snippet of what can be done in virtual reality applied to the world of dementia. I think we showed you some applications at the level of diagnosis, but for me what is more important is how we can use that in terms of intervention and support, given the lack of drugs for dementia. And really the two things for me, most importantly with regard to individuals with dementia, is that trying to maintain independence for as long as we can, which means finding ways for these people to stay at home, stay with their loved one, with their family, being able to live a good life, despite the fact that they have a diagnosis of dementia. But when comes the time where the family might not be able to look after their loved one anymore, they need to go to a nursing home, then we can find ways to prepare them for this transition, but also find ways for them to have as good quality of life as is possible, and using things like these virtual gardens or social interactions. So for them to be connected with the people they like, they love, because we are social individuals. We're not meant to live isolated. We need contacts. And I think, again, virtual reality, as Hamish was saying, is not an isolating event. It's something that will help connect and maintain connection, which is so important in people with dementia. Hamish.
So this last section on virtual reality, I have to admit, is a little self-indulgent, but this is an opportunity, a great opportunity for us to try and get a bit of feedback from you. Now, I'm suspecting that those of you that braved the weather today are probably already early adopters or supporters of virtual reality. You probably don't need preaching to the converted, as the expression goes, but we have been doing demonstrations like this now for the last 3 years, more than 100 demonstrations like this, and we're still at this point not really sure whether people like yourselves, members of the general public, are on our side of the fence thinking this is exciting, or on the other side of the fence wondering whether it's all a bit of a con. So what I've set up here today is I'm going to ask you to be the emperors and to make a determination on this. So for the purposes of that, we have the Colosseum here, and I'm going to fly down and I'm going to become this gladiator. And as you can see, the lion here, I might shrink down a little bit, the lion here is menacing me, the University of Sydney lion is menacing me, and it's because we need to ask you whether it's going to be thumbs up or thumbs down in your opinion for virtual reality. If you think virtual reality is still 2 years away, despite what you've seen today, or you think it's a gimmick or a game, or it's just a bit of a fad and it'll all be over next Wednesday, then I would ask you to just sit and do nothing. If, however, like us, you see the amazing potential for bringing real benefit to clinicians and patients and students and society in general, then I'm going to go down on one knee and I'm going to ask you to raise your thumbs in the air if your verdict is live. Please raise your thumbs up in the air because Jono is going to take a photograph that I hope to use in our battle to bring this kind of technology to more patients, more clinicians and more students. So hopefully you've got your thumbs up. Thumbs up! It's thumbs up! Thank goodness for that.
Almost there. Got it.
And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you.
So the next Sydney Science Forum is Adventures in the Virusphere, Charting the World of Viruses, presented on the 12th of September by Professor Eddie Holmes from the School of Life and Environmental Sciences. So please join with us for that event. And thank you for attending, and please join with me in thanking our speakers again for a wonderful presentation.
If people don't mind me having just one last word, I know I can't resist, but I really have to acknowledge the maker of the program that we used tonight, because we think that this is incredible technology. The hardware, all very well, you can buy that at JB Hi-Fi tomorrow, but the program we used tonight is called NEOS VR by a guy in the Czech Republic named Froxius and a company called SolarAx. He's given this program away for nothing. 3 years programming. It's allowed us to produce this version of a presentation 1,000 times, in my mind anyway, better than a PowerPoint, without any money spent. And I think this is a huge step up in what's available. This is the killer app, in my opinion, for research and education. So I'd like to thank Froxius for this amazing piece of work.
Thank you.